Welcome to Journey at Home. If today's your first time tuning in, or maybe it's your first time in a long time, hey, thank you for celebrating Easter with us. I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications so you stay connected to all this helpful content we're creating, because we're trying to help you follow Jesus and live a better life. Now, I don't know what your Easter experiences were like as a kid, but when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, Easter Sunday felt like a full-blown performance. There's usually a choir concert. Everybody bought new outfits. The men all wore suits. The women got new dresses. They were wearing these derby-sized hats to church. And kids like me, well, we'd show up in suits that were white suits. Yeah, you don't see that much anymore, do you? You got to have some serious swagger to pull that off as a 6-year-old, let me tell you. It's fashion fits long before the NBA guys. Today, though, my mom's just relieved I don't walk in on Easter, well, wearing a hoodie. But back then it was different. And some people like that pressure of performing, and some didn't. But there is a pressure none of us like. It's the pressure of performing for God's approval. You know what that feels like, don't you? The idea that you got to be good, you got to do good to earn God's approval. You start wondering, am I doing enough? You got to follow certain rules and avoid certain behaviors to be loved by Him. And there's a sense in which you feel like until you get all that cleaned up and you learn to perform better, you're never really good with God. Now, that pressure comes with some problems. First, and you know this from experience, you never really know if your performance is good enough, because depending on who you talk to or what church you grew up around, there's a different list of rules to follow and standards to meet. Not only that, but performing also turns us into the one thing we all hate. It turns us into hypocrites. Because if I've got to have my act together to be accepted by God, well, I actually can't be honest with God, and I can't be honest with you when my act is not together. And more times than not, we don't have our act together, do we? So I'm just left showing up at church faking it and hiding it until, all the parts of me that I don't want you to see get hidden, because it's really, really messy. But maybe the worst problem with performing for God is it keeps me from ever being close to Him. Think about it. Do you have great relationships with people when you feel you need to earn their acceptance and their approval? Well, of course not. If I've got to perform for you, I'll never know what it feels like to be unconditionally loved and accepted by you. I'm left with the constant uncertainty of not knowing exactly where I'm going to stand with you in any given moment. That is miserable in a human relationship. And it's brutal in a relationship with God. Maybe it's why some of you have walked away and you've given up, because it just felt impossible and unattainable to you. Well, if you can relate to that, I've got some really good news. One day, around AD 33, a young man approached Jesus, assuming he had to perform his way into God's good graces. And he wanted to know just how good was good enough to be good with God. And so Matthew, who's a friend of Jesus and was there for this, he tells us this guy asked Jesus, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to inherit or to get eternal life?" In other words, I'm trying to make sure I'm doing good enough to be good with God. I'm committed to performing, so just give me a list, Jesus. And Jesus responds with a curious question. He says, "Why do you ask me what's good? There's only one who's good." In other words, hey, God's the only one who can define what the standard is to be good with Him. And then Jesus affirms He is God by answering the question that He just said only God can answer. He looks at the man and He says, if you want to enter life, keep the commandments. Now, this young Jewish guy, he knew there were 613 of these commandments, and he understood perfectly what Jesus was referring to. If you want to perform your way into being good with God, Jesus was saying, well, the standard for that is perfection. Not pretty good or mostly good or I'm better than most. The standard is perfection. So he asked a question that all of us would have asked. He said, well, which ones? Which commandments? Could you narrow it down, please? I'm not trying to ace the test. I'm just trying to pass it. Just narrow down the performance list so I know what to do to pass God's test. And Jesus kind of chuckles, I think, and goes, okay, I'll play along. I'll play this game, and I'll give you a few. So he said back to the young man, well, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. Honor your father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself. So forget the need to go through all 613 commands. This list, that's all we need to know. We don't meet the standard of perfection, do we? We don't even keep those 6. But this young man, he's lacking a little self-awareness. So with all of his false confidence, he looks back at Jesus and says, okay, all of these I've kept. So what do I still lack? And it was at this point that Jesus decided to provide a little self-awareness for him. So he went straight for the young man's heart. He said, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. In other words, if you're certain you're that perfect, then you're going to have no problem giving up what you love most to follow me and to help others. And Matthew tells us when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. Now, Jesus' point wasn't that we all have to sell everything we have to be good with God. He mentions this to this young man because he's trying to help this guy be aware that this guy was falling short of God's standard and he didn't even see it. His point was the standard is perfection and none of us meet it. The standard is perfection and none of us can attain it, which puts us all in the same predicament, doesn't it? It means we've all fallen short. We're all imperfect. We're all sinners, which means the performance-based approach is a doomed approach for any of us who are trying it. Now, nobody knew this more than Jesus' friend Peter. Peter spent 3 years trying to perform for Jesus, and quite honestly, he felt pretty good about his performance. This is a guy who trusted Jesus enough to walk on water for a minute. It's a guy who first said he believed Jesus was God in human flesh. Peter's the guy who swore he'd stay by Jesus' side and he'd die with him. But you may know the story. Peter failed miserably. He ended up betraying his best friend. He denied he even knew Jesus. When Jesus was arrested and crucified, he just walked away from him at the lowest point of Jesus' life. So Peter knew what it was like to make a mess of things with Jesus. He knew what it was like to fail the performance test. He knew what it was like to fall so short that he was certain there was no hope left for him. But imagine this. It was this same Peter who, after Jesus' crucifixion, wrote these words of hope for all of us in 1 Peter 3. He said, for Christ also suffered once for sins. Whose sins? Well, not Jesus' sins. Jesus did what none of us have been able to do. He kept all the commandments. He always loved his neighbor as himself. He met God's standard of perfection. Peter said, he died as the righteous for the unrighteous to bring you to God. When Jesus died, the worst possible thing happened to the best possible person. And it turned out to be the best possible opportunity for us. This is the opposite of the performance plan, isn't it? Peter says through Jesus' death, he paid the debt we all had with God. He cleaned up everything we'd messed up, and we don't have to perform at all for it anymore. Now Jesus could bring us to God through the forgiveness plan. Now we didn't have to earn our way in. We could be gifted our way in. And Peter, well, he knew this personally because Jesus had offered him that same gift of forgiveness he offers us. After he betrayed Jesus, Jesus had come to Peter and freely offered him forgiveness, grace, and hope. Forgiveness for sin, grace for the mess we make, and hope for our future. Jesus showed up to offer poor performers like you and me what we need most, a better way to be good with God, a doable way to have a relationship with God. If we're honest, none of us can perform perfectly into a relationship with God anyway, but we sure can be forgiven into one. Any of us can do that. This is what changed Peter's life forever. And if he were here and you ask him how he could be so confident that this is true and it's available for you, I think Peter would say, oh, well, hey, hand me a Bible. Let me read you what my good friend John wrote. Do you remember this? John, his friend, wrote early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and she saw that stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running, Peter would tell us. She came running to me and John, my friend, and she said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Because none of Jesus' friends were expecting a resurrection. They thought his body had been stolen. So John tells us that Peter and he started for the tomb. Both of them were running. But John outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Probably not a detail Peter thought was necessary to include. And then John writes that he bent over and he looked in at the strips of linen lying there in the tomb, but he didn't go in. And then John tells us that Peter came along behind him. He went straight into the tomb. He saw those strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. That cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linens. And then the disciples went back to where they were staying. And a few hours later, if we were talking to Peter, he would tell us on the evening of that first day of the week, when all those disciples were gathered together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Peter would say, oh, Jesus came. And he stood among us and he said, peace be with you. I think he had to say that because they were freaking out, right? And John writes, after he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. So I think if Peter were here, he would say, oh my gosh, we were overjoyed because he was alive. We were overjoyed because now we were confident everything Jesus had told us was true. We were overjoyed because forgiveness and grace and hope were now available to me and to you. So Peter would say, listen, you can trust everything Jesus said because he rose from the dead. And he would tell us, I personally experienced his forgiveness and his grace and his hope, bringing me into a relationship with God. And you can too. So my question for you is this. What plan are you on? The forgiveness plan or the performance plan? Have you ever accepted Jesus' gift of forgiveness? Are you still trying to prove you deserve it and perform your way into it? Listen, if you're trying to prove and perform, how's that working for you? I'm going to take a guess. It's exhausting. It's discouraging. It's frustrating, isn't it? Listen, I have great news for you. Easter killed the performance. You do not have to follow the performance plan anymore. You want forgiveness? You want grace? You want hope? It is a gift that Jesus offers you freely. He's already paid for the gift with his own life. The question is just, do you have enough humility to accept it? Because the only thing that keeps us from it is our pride. If you'll just admit you can't earn it, if you'll reach out and take it, God will freely offer it to you. That's how much he loves you. So, you willing to do that? If so, I want to invite you just to tell him right now. Just say, Jesus, I'm accepting your forgiveness. I'm going to stop trying to perform my way into being good with you. I give you my life. And Jesus, I thank you for giving me yours. Now listen, if you just told God that, this is an Easter you will never forget. I'd love for you to let me know you made that decision because I would love to celebrate with you. And I hope you have a happy Easter.